All right, why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone. We're going to be focusing today on the opportunity to refinance 7A debt into SBA 504 loans. This is the result of a recent rule change that went into effect last week, and we believe really represents a fantastic opportunity for our referral source community, brokers, and other intermediaries to um, originate opportunities not on a one-off basis, but really can take advantage of um, portfolios or uh, large slugs of deals, working with either borrowers or your bank relationships to bring those opportunities to bear here. So we're going to go through the opportunity. We're going to talk about the rule change and its impact. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the 7A market and how that works, and the dynamic between the 7A loan and the refinance vehicle, SBA 504. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits to the borrowers, the benefits to the banks that are holding these 7A loans, and how you can talk to them about refinancing those assets into 504 and what's in it for them, so to speak, as well as the general opportunities to the broker and intermediary community, and then talk a little bit about what we need here at Liberty in order to submit a deal, and then any questions that pop up from attendees. So jumping right in, Lon, if you wouldn't mind flipping to page 2. Let's start off with a little bit of a overview of Liberty SPF. So started the company about 10 years ago. We've been in business. We've got about a 10, 12-year track record focusing on the SBA asset class, not only as direct originators of 504 loans and 7As, but also as participants in the secondary market, the bonds and the interest-only strips that are created from these assets. Since inception, we've closed and funded over $2 billion in loans. Very experienced management team with a 10-year track record working together. Some of the folks from our management team are on this call. I'm going to be leading the webinar today for the most part, but we do have Alex Prombaum on the line as well, who can answer any questions that may come up that are more technical in nature. The idea here is that there's a recent rule change that went into effect last week, and is a really big deal. What the rule change says is essentially that you can now use government guaranteed debt, namely the SBA 504 program, to refi a borrower's existing government guaranteed debt. Since the inception of these programs in the 1950s, government has never allowed borrowers to use government guaranteed debt to refi an existing government guaranteed loan. You've never been allowed to use a 504 loan to refi a borrower's 7A loan. And this is a change that went into effect last week, where you can now use a 504 loan to refi a 7A loan. And there are a few flavors of what that can look like. And we're going to walk through some of those scenarios here in a little bit. I think one of the big ideas in terms of why this is important speaks to the fact of what a 7A loan structure looks like, why borrowers use 7A loans, how that loan program works in terms of the lenders that are involved. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of the 7A loan program to illustrate that point. So typically 7A is used for businesses, for working capital. And in more recent years, over the last 20 years, as that program has increased in terms of how big of a loan you can do in 7A, over the last 10 years, that's gone from 2.5 million, 5 million, and in previous years has faced similar increases. So as the loan size for 7A loan has increased per loan, you've seen more borrowers using 7A to finance real estate. One of the big uses of a 7A loan is for borrowers to utilize that loan structure for ground up construction. So you see a lot of sponsors who are using typically floating rate 7A debt, which typically is high leverage debt and has a short prepay period mandated by law to be no more than 3 years. And so you typically will see a 3-year prepay penalty structure on that loan. They're typically floating rate, but they do offer borrowers who are doing ground up construction projects the benefit of a high loan to cost loan structure. So you see a lot of hotel borrowers, hotel developers who are using 7A loans to do ground up construction. You see self-storage facility developers using 7A loans to do ground up self-storage facilities. You'll see healthcare operators, smaller facility sizes for skilled nursing and assisted living, using 7A for ground up construction. And one of the issues that occurs because of that high leverage dynamic is that a borrower is typically stuck in that loan because unlike in a conventional sizing, which would be closer to 65 to 75% of cost, once you have completion and lease up, you're typically still at a higher leverage point, which makes it difficult to refi into a conventional fixed rate permanent financing structure, right? So you have borrowers who are building assets using high leverage floating rate debt. Typically, today you'll see that at 6% floating, who don't have the ability once they complete their business plan to refi into a lower cost fixed rate financing vehicle, and it takes them several years beyond that point, typically, if never, to generate the equity value in the property that puts them at a leverage point where they can refinance into a conventional fixed rate vehicle. The big idea here with the recent rule change is that these borrowers can now use another high leverage government guaranteed program, the SBA 504 loan, to refi from a floating rate SBA loan into a much lower cost fixed rate SBA 504 loan and potentially pull cash out. The way that the 7A lenders typically underwrite and fund these loans is that they will make a 7A loan to a borrower, typically at a floating rate. A lot of the smaller banks, not talking about Wells Fargo or the super regional PNCs of the world, typically those banks are holding these loans on their balance sheet the entirety of the loan to term, and they use the government guarantee as a credit enhancement. But most small banks that are originating 7A loans are taking advantage of the fact that 75% of that loan is guaranteed by the government. They have the ability to sell that government guaranteed 7A loan portion into the secondary market, into the bond market, and they get paid a huge premium up to 18 or 20 points. There is some sharing with the SBA, but they are able to monetize a significant amount of fees up front by selling the government guaranteed portion of the loan into the secondary market. So you'll typically see for smaller community bank lenders is, especially for the higher volume 7A lenders who are very involved in this market, is that they will originate these loans, will sell their 75% guaranteed portions into the secondary market, will monetize that asset pretty much all up front. And then they're holding 25% residual positions, which are unguaranteed. And those aren't necessarily the most attractive assets for a bank to be holding, particularly after they've already monetized most and pulled most of the juice out of that trade. And so that's sort of an overview of the 7A market in terms of the dynamic between the lenders and borrowers. The big idea here is that with this new rule change, these borrowers and frankly these banks now have a viable refinance option to not only do a rate and term refi, but also potentially to pull some cash out in terms of for eligible working capital. There are two types of scenarios that we want to talk about today in terms of what does this actually look like in terms of sizing these loans and looking at sources and uses. So the first scenario that we're going to talk about is 504 loan without expansion. And basically what this means is for the borrowers who are looking to do a rate and term refinance, are not doing any more CapEx to their property, okay? It doesn't mean that they aren't going to be eligible for cash out. This is for borrowers who are not able to do, who are not doing any CapEx that is associated with this project. And there are two types of kind of sources and uses, variety of scenarios here. One where you're not doing any expansion CapEx, and one where you are doing expansion and CapEx, because with the 504 refinance program, we're actually able to not only do a refinance of your existing debt, but you can also use additional uses for development, CapEx development, to do further development to the project, to the property. A very high level in the 504 debt refinance scenario without expansion, a borrower with an existing 7A loan can refinance that existing debt and potentially pull up to 20% of the value of the property out as cash out, as long as it is used for eligible uses, which there's a number of eligible uses primarily associated with working capital. And the underwriters here at Liberty SBF, our team, knows those eligible uses very well. Some ability to kind of do some look backs and size the deal, optimize the amount of cash out for the borrower. It has to be eligible, obviously. There's some, the SBA provides some leeway in terms of how that is viewed. That being said, the way that we look at this in total is, what is the amount of debt that is, what is the existing amount of debt on the property today? Let's just use a hypothetical example. If you have a property today that is worth $100, borrower built the property ground up. Let's say it was a self-storage facility 2 years ago, and they built it using $500,000 of debt using a 7A loan. The way that we would size the new 504, if there's no additional expansion or CapEx associated with the project, is we would say we're going to be able to finance $500,000 of the existing debt. We're going to refi the existing debt piece out. We're going to be able to finance all the eligible closing costs. And then because the property is worth $100, the borrower would be eligible for, $100 in this theoretical example where they have $50 of debt from the 7A loan, they would be eligible for another $20 of cash out. On a $1 million value where you have $500,000 of existing 7A debt, you would be eligible, because the property is worth $1 million, you'd be eligible for another $200,000 of cash out, as long as the total LTV of the new 504 loan structure is not more than 85% LTV. And if there was no cash out, we'd be able to size that refi up to 90%, including all closing costs and expenses, up to 90% LTV. The big thing to keep in mind here is if there's no expansion, no CapEx associated with the project, you can do a rate and term refi for your borrower, pull up to 20% cash out, and size the entire new loan up to 85% of the value of the current value of the property. The biggest thing to keep in mind in terms of this refi opportunity is that you're talking about refining a borrower with a 5 to 6% floating rate loan into a new 504 loan where your debenture is currently 2.88% fixed, 25 years fully amortized. Even with a blended rate on our first, our first lien loans are typically somewhere in the high threes, low fives, depending on the asset type, whether it's hospitality in a tertiary market on the higher end of the rate spectrum, or a warehouse or industrial property, a primary or secondary market on the lower end end of the rate spectrum. You're talking about taking someone from a 6% floating rate 7A loan into a loan with a blended rate, somewhere in the high threes, low fours. You're talking about somewhere between 200 basis points and potentially more of rate differential, which on a maximum loan amount of 7A of $5 million, which could be even higher 504 loan, you're talking about saving the borrower anywhere between $100,000 and $150,000 in debt service per year, which is significant, plus being able to provide them with cash out opportunities. So again, I think in terms of there's no CapEx going on at the project with new uses, the best way to keep in mind the value proposition here for the borrower is you're going from 6% floating, 5 to 6% floating to high mid threes to high threes, low fours fixed, and you're able to pull cash out. That's a winning value proposition for most borrowers that are in floating rate loans, that are in floating rate 7A loans today. There's a distinction, obviously, we talked about deals with expansion. So you can take 7A loan, refi it, provide borrower with proceeds, and also have those uses go towards CapEx. It's a little bit of a different rule here in terms of how that works. And there's been some changes, and improvements to how that program is sized by the SBA. The big thing to keep in mind here is that you are limited on how much uses can be used towards CapEx, and they size that based on the amount of existing debt you have at the property. For example, if you have a $1 million loan, going back to our example, the math $100 million loan, you have a $500,000 existing debt. You cannot finance more than another $500,000 in CapEx. You're not allowed to refinance existing indebtedness where the project is increased more than 100% of the new expansion costs. So there are some limitations when there is CapEx involved in the property. Obviously, we here at Liberty can help you work through some of the nuances of how these programs work. I think the biggest opportunity, frankly, for borrowers is the 504 debt refinance without expansion, where again, you're refining the existing debt and you're pulling cash out and financing all your closing costs, moving from a floating rate structure into a fixed rate structure. We talked a little bit about benefits to the borrower already. I'm going to quickly recap. Again, most 7A loans are floating rate structures. These are the structures that generate the biggest economics for the lenders, the banks that are originating the 7A loans. In order for the banks to make max premium selling them into the secondary market, they need to charge anywhere between 5 and 6% coupons on these loans. And there's obviously a huge differential between the 7A floating rate loan and the 504 loan. In an example where you have a $5 million 7A loan, which is the max amount allowed under the program, that represents anywhere between $100,000 and $150,000 a year in debt service savings by doing the refi. In addition to any in addition to any cash out the borrower is achieving by doing the refinance. The other thing to keep in mind is that a 7A loan only has a 3-year prepay penalty. So even if they have existing prepay, even if they're inside the 3 years, it's typically a step down on a 7A. And if they've been in the 7A loan for more than 3 years, not going to have any prepayment penalty costs for doing the refinance. There's very little incentive for a borrower who's in a 7A loan, who has already completed their business plan stay in that 7A loan. And so this is a huge opportunity for brokers and intermediaries to go focus on this market. This is a huge refi wave opportunity. And obviously, there's very little incentive for a borrower to be staying in the 7A loan. Let's talk a little bit about the benefits to the banks and the 7A lenders, because ultimately, at the end of the day, one of the ways that we think that our intermediary and broker relationships can monetize this opportunity by working with smaller community banks in your network. Obviously, you're working with a lot of lenders out there. You know, smaller community banks who are going to have these loans on their books. Rather than going directly to the borrowers, one way of attacking this opportunity is by going after banks who have some of these loans on their books and incentivizing the banks to work with you to refinance out loans on their balance sheet that are no longer attractive for them to be on their balance sheet, and potentially provide them with incentive to do that. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is that on most 504 transactions, Liberty SBF is able to pay between 1 to 2 points in referral fees to our brokers who send us those deals that close. So if you go to we have 2 brokers right now that we work very closely with who have presented us with opportunities with 2 small community banks that have between 5 and 8 opportunities each, loans that they originated 3 to 5 years ago. They're not interested in having them on their books anymore. They have to hold capital against the residuals. They've already pulled all of the economics out of those deals, and they're perfectly happy getting those deals refinanced off their books. One way to increase that incentive is to come up with some sort of fee splitting arrangement with that bank. So on any of those 5 to 8 opportunities with a particular bank that you've identified that we can be working with, we're able to pay between 1.5 and 2 points total as referral fees on each of those deals, which leaves, I believe, plenty of ammunition to be doing fee sharing between the intermediary and the bank that you're working with. As we mentioned, in terms of how the 7A program works, most of the economics are realized by the originating bank during the beginning portion of the loan. They're selling 75% of that asset off of their balance sheet almost immediately, and then they're retaining and servicing a 25% retained, position in the loan. If they're able to move that asset off of their balance sheet, recycle the capital to make new 7A loans, which have new economics associated with them, and as a kicker, receive an additional fee by the refinancing lender and the intermediary that put the deal together, i.e. Liberty and our broker relationships vis-a-vis the bank. We're also able to incentivize those banks by sending them a fee when that loan moves off of their balance sheet. So they get capital freed up to make more 7A loans, and they can potentially get some additional incentive economics as part of the refinance opportunity. Danced around this a little bit, but I think the biggest opportunity here is that, number one, you've got total incentive for the borrowers to refi out of 7A loans into 504 loans. The 7A market is a $20 billion per year new origination market. So over the last 3 to 5 years, you have probably 100 to 150 billion outstanding opportunities. Even if you're just talking about half of that market for real estate backed deals, you probably have 100 to 150 billion in deals outstanding that are eligible for this opportunity. That is a huge target market. We can identify these loans based on the top, community banks that are originators of this stuff. The SBA on their website has a lot of information available by market on who the top 7A lending banks are in your market. You can identify those banks. Most of our intermediaries have great relationships with the local banks in their market. And this is an opportunity to go to those banks and look at not one-off opportunities, bulk refinance opportunities by doing it hub and spoke rather than going directly to the borrowers. As I mentioned, Liberty SBF has the ability to send up to 2 points in referral fees to our referral sources who are executing on these opportunities. And we have no problem doing that, not only on a one-off basis, we have no problem doing that on a bulk sale basis. Obviously, the way you want to cut that in with the bank is up to our referral sources, but with 2 points per deal on 5 to 8 bills per bank, it would seem that there's plenty of excess margin to send additional incentive to the banks such that they're moving these non-guaranteed residual assets off their balance sheet, recycling capital to make new 7A loans, receiving an exit fee for our referral sources through us as partners. And we can continue to do this because this is a permanent change to the program. So as community banks reload, make new 7A loans, it only creates new opportunities to harvest these refinance deals into the future. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to submit a deal with us. Warren Rocca, who couldn't be on the call today, is our head of originations and runs our wholesale group, which means he is our head of sales who interfaces with our intermediary and broker community. If you have any questions on this opportunity, if you have deals that you want to run by, if you want to talk generally about this or more specifically, if you have actionable opportunities you'd like us to review, please reach out to Warren Rocca. His email address is vrocca@libertysbf.com. Obviously, I'm always available. Alex Cohen, @libertysbf.com as well. All of the contact information for most of our principals and our senior folks is on our website. If you present a loan request, we typically are providing quotes within 24 hours, including providing you with sizing information about what we think we can do on a refinance from a rate and term refinance standpoint, as well as for eligible cash out uses. Once we receive a full package on that deal, especially if you're working with an existing bank, we're going to be able to provide you with a commitment within 48 hours of receiving that information. Once we get a signed CCL and a deposit, we're off to the races. And even with a little bit of slowdown in the SBA today with approvals, we're still closing 504 loans in 45 to 60 days. Let's talk about required documentation. So 2 things to get the ball rolling here. Most important is one of the big aspects of 504 refi that is important to understand is that a lot of our sizing and sizing limitations are based on the existing debt. And so one important piece of required documentation is information on the existing note and lien instrument. So bank promissory note, recorded mortgage, recorded lien. We need to see a payment transcript for the most recent 12 months for that existing debt. And we need documentation to support 85 to 15 test. If it's existing SBA debt, in other words, if we are refining a 7A loan, we need a copy of the authorization. We have to do a substantiation benefits test. There's one thing that we didn't go over because I want to keep it high level. You'll see some of this information in the full PowerPoint document that we'll send out to all attendees after the call, which talks about a 10% benefits test. We need to be able to show that the refinance from the 7A into the 504 loan, including all repayment penalties and other costs, is saving the borrower 10%. Obviously, if you're going from a 6% floating rate instrument into a high 3s, low 4s fixed rate at instrument, we expect to be saving 10% plus a monthly savings. So we have to substantiate it, but we don't expect there to be issues related to that. Verification process that needs to occur, that the existing 7A lender is unable to modify the existing payment. That is really a non-issue for lenders who are selling their 7A loans into the secondary market. The reason being is that once that loan is sold into the bond market, the bond investors have little to no incentive of modifying the loan and little to no mechanism for working with that bank to modify the loan. So in reality, small bank lenders who participate in the 7A capital markets, which are most middle market and smaller community banks, are selling their guaranteed portions into the bond market. And so there's that verification as as it relates to the modification of the loan to be a non-issue as well. These are things that we need to substantiate. This is what we do all day long. You'll work with the Liberty team to make sure that our submission to the SBA satisfies all of the requirements. So that is the majority of the presentation, the majority of the topics that we wanted to cover today. Again, as a recap, this is a huge opportunity in our mind for a number of reasons. Number one, you've never been able to refi government guaranteed debt with existing government guaranteed debt with new government guaranteed debt. It provides the borrowers with the opportunity to refi from a floating rate structure into a fixed rate structure and eventually pull cash out or use additional proceeds to do additional construction projects at the site. There's a massive market for these loans, by our estimate, between 150, between 100 to 150 billion of outstanding loans that are eligible for this program. And it provides the borrowers with an opportunity to do this on a programmatic basis versus a one-off basis. So brokers who don't necessarily think about SBA loans or loans within the size range should not be thinking about this as one-off SBA origination. You should be thinking about this as a programmatic trade opportunity because of your relationships with local community banks, where you can pick with those banks larger blocks of loan opportunities for us to work on programmatically to refinance. Not only that, this is a permanent change. So this is not a one and done opportunity. As banks reload their capital and originate new 7A loans, as years pass, and as years pass from loans that are still under business plan, this will be a seriatim opportunity for our referral sources to take advantage of large block refinance. I'll take a look at the question and question block here. If anyone who's in attendance has any questions, happy to answer any questions now. As a follow-up point, we're going to be sending out a copy of this recording as well as some additional information. We have a one-pager that we're going to be sending out, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation we went through today. And what we'll have in that PowerPoint presentation, which was not included in the webinar today, are 3 or 4 case study examples of 504 refi without expansion and 504 refi with expansion. If anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them into the question and answer section of the Zoom webinar. We'll wait a couple of seconds here if anyone has any questions, and if not, we look forward to working with folks on this opportunity. And as I mentioned, happy to answer any questions that come up in the future. And like I said, we'll be following up with some additional information. Doesn't look like we have any questions at this point, so that will conclude our webinar for today. Thanks everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your summer. Thanks so much.